There is a name carved into a slab of dark green stone, a name made of two small pictures, a fish and a chisel, and that name is more than 5,000 years old. It belongs to a man who lived so long ago that almost everything you think of when you think of ancient Egypt had not yet happened. The pyramids of Giza had not been imagined. The golden mask of the boy king Tutankhamun lay some 18 centuries in the future. Cleopatra, the queen we so often picture when we picture Egypt at all, would not be born for more than 3,000 years after this man drew his last breath. And yet here he is. At the very beginning, the first of his kind, the one the later Egyptians themselves would point back to and say, "This is where it started. This is where we began." His name, as best we can read it, was Narmer tonight. We are going to follow him. Slowly, quietly, the way you might follow a single set of footprints across cool sand at the edge of a great river. From the first faint mark to the last. We are going to begin in a world that had no Egypt, no single kingdom of that name, no Pharaoh, no double crown, only a long green ribbon of fertile land threaded along a river, broken into rival territories, north and south, each with its own rulers and its own symbols and its own way of seeing the world. And we are going to watch step by step as that divided land becomes one. As a southern king rises out of the haze of prehistory, gathers power, marches, marries, builds, and stamps his name on a stone that survives, to this very day we are going to watch the first crown of a single Egypt settle onto a single head. It is one of the quietest and most astonishing facts in all of human history, and most people have never heard his name. Before there were nations as we understand them, before there were the great empires of the ancient world, there was this, a unified kingdom along the Nile, governed from one center, ruled by one man sometime around 3,100 years before the Common Era. Archaeologists place him at the close of a long age they call the predynastic period. In the final stretch they label Naqada III, the last shadowy chapter before written history truly begins in Egypt. He stands precisely on the line between the world we can only guess at and the world we can read. Behind him, silence. In front of him, 3,000 years of one of the longest continuous civilizations the world has ever known. And the strange thing, the thing that will follow us through this entire long night, is how little we actually know about him, and how much we can still say. We do not have his face. We are not certain where his body lies. We cannot agree, even now after more than a century of careful digging, whether he truly conquered the North in a single great war, or whether he simply finished a process that others had begun before him. We are not even sure his name should be read the way we read it. And yet, we have his name carved in stone. We have objects bearing his mark scattered from the deep south of the Nile Valley to lands far to the northeast. We have the testimony of the Egyptians themselves, who kept lists of their kings for thousands of years and placed him, or someone very like him, at the head of those lists, the founder, the first. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand who this man was as well as anyone living can understand him, where he came from, the divided world he was born into, how he may have risen, what he is believed to have done, the city he is said to have founded, the wife who stood beside him, the dynasty that grew from him, and the long, quiet argument that scholars still have about almost every part of his story. You will understand why a fish and a chisel scratched onto stone before the alphabet existed can still make careful and serious people lean closer and lower their voices. This is not a story of certainty. It is a story told at the very edge of memory, where history and the fog before history blur into one another. And that is part of why it is so beautiful. We are reaching back almost as far as it is possible to reach and still find a human being standing there, with a name, with a crown, with something he wanted us to know. Let me give you a sense of just how far back this is, because the numbers alone are difficult to hold in the mind. When the Great Pyramid of Giza was being raised, that astonishing mountain of stone that we treat as the very symbol of ancient Egypt, Narmer had already been dead for something close to 5 centuries. To the builders of that pyramid, Narmer was not a contemporary. He was an ancient figure, a founder out of the deep past, as distant from them as the early Middle Ages are from us. And those pyramid builders themselves lived more than 4,500 years ago. So when we speak of Narmer, we are speaking of a man who is already old history to people we ourselves regard as impossibly old, layer upon layer of time, folding back on itself, until the mind grows quiet trying to follow it. And consider this. The Egyptians who came long after him, the priests and scribes of later ages, men who lived 1,000 and 2,000 and even 3,000 years after Narmer, still remembered him. They still wrote his name, or a name they connected with him, at the head of their long king lists. They still thought of him as the beginning, across a span of time longer than all of recorded European history. The Egyptians kept the memory of their first king alive, passing it down generation after generation, scribe after scribe, until at last it reached the Greek writers who would carry it to us. There is something almost unbearably moving in that, a chain of memory stretching unbroken across thousands of years, all of it leading back to one man standing on a riverbank at the dawn of his world. That is the man we are going to spend this long night with. Not a myth, not a monster of legend, but a human being who lived and ruled and died, and who left just enough behind that we can still faintly make him out. We will move slowly, and we will circle back often, returning again and again to the central questions, so that even as you drift, the story stays with you. Where did he come from? What did he do? What did he build? Who stood? And why, after more than 5,000 years, does his name still matter? There is no hurry tonight. We have all the time in the world, the way the ancient Egyptians seemed to have all the time in the world, measuring their lives not in minutes and hours, but in the slow turning of the seasons and the great yearly rhythm of the river. We will not rush. We will let the story unfold at the pace of the Nile itself, slow, steady, patient, carrying us gently downstream from the very beginning to the very end. If your eyes grow heavy, let them close. If your thoughts begin to drift, let them drift. You do not need to follow every name and every date. You need only let the long, quiet current of the story carry you, the way the river carried the boats of the first kings down toward rest. This is a story made to be drifted through, like a slow journey on calm water under a wide and darkening sky. Before we begin, if you find ancient Egypt as fascinating as we do, take a moment to like the video or subscribe. It is a small thing, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. So tonight, let the modern world fall away. Let the screens and the noise and the hurry of our own age dissolve, the way the lights of a city dissolve when you walk out into the desert and the stars come up. Let the centuries roll back, one by one, past the Romans, past the great temples, past the pyramids, past everything, until we are standing at the very beginning on the bank of a river in a land that does not yet have a name, watching a man who is about to give it one. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand Narmer, you first have to understand the world he stepped into, because it was not yet the world we picture. There was no single Egypt. There was, instead, a long and narrow country shaped entirely by a single river. And that river is the place where everything in this story begins. Picture the Nile. It runs from south to north, which can feel upside down to us, because on the map it seems to flow upward toward the sea. But the land tilts that way, and so the water moves north, gathering, widening, until at last it spreads out into a great green fan of marsh and channel and rich black soil before it empties into the Mediterranean. The Egyptians had 2 words for the 2 halves of their land, and those words tell you almost everything. They called the long, narrow southern stretch, hemmed in by cliffs and desert, the upper land, upper, because it lay upriver, higher up the course of the Nile, and they called the wide, flat, fertile northern fan, where the river split into many branches, the lower land, downriver, closer to the sea, Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north, the valley and the delta, two lands, joined by one river, and for a very long time, divided. Everything in Egypt grew out of the rhythm of that river. Once every year, swollen by distant rains far to the south, in lands the Egyptians barely knew, the Nile would rise and overflow its banks. It would drown the fields in slow brown water, and then, as the months passed, it would withdraw, and it would leave behind a fresh layer of dark fertile silt, soft and damp and ready for seed. The Egyptians called this black earth, and from that black earth they fed themselves so well that, in time, they could feed far more than themselves. They could feed builders and priests and soldiers and scribes and kings. The whole of Egyptian civilization, all the wonder of it, sits on top of that yearly gift of mud. Without the flood, there is no Egypt, and it was along the green edges of this river, in scattered villages and growing towns, that the people who would become the first Egyptians slowly took shape. Now go back, in your mind, to the centuries before Narmer. This is the world the archaeologists call the pre-dynastic, before the dynasties, before the line of kings began. It is a world without grand pyramids, without temples of cut stone, without writing as we know it. But it is not a poor or simple world. The people of the South, in particular, had grown skilled and prosperous. They lived in towns along the river. They farmed wheat and barley, they raised cattle and sheep and goats. They fished the Nile and hunted in the marshes. They made pottery of real beauty, painted with boats and animals and dancing figures. They carved fine objects out of ivory and bone and hard stone. They traded up and down the river and out into the deserts on either side, seeking gold and copper and precious stones. And they reached far to the south into the land they called Nubia, and far to the northeast into the lands along the eastern Mediterranean. They buried their dead with care, with goods for a life they believed continued beyond the grave. They were, in short, a people on the edge of something enormous, gathering wealth and skill and population, pressing toward a threshold no people had ever crossed before. And as they grew, they organized scattered villages became towns. Towns gathered into larger territories under powerful local leaders. And in the south, in Upper Egypt, 3 centers rose above the rest. 3 towns whose names you should hold on to because Narmer comes out of this southern world. There was a place the Greeks would later call Hierakonpolis, the city of the falcon, which the Egyptians knew as Nikon. There was the nearby town, the Greeks called this, or Thinis, somewhere near the sacred site of Abydos, and there was Nakada, a little to the north. These southern centers were rich and ambitious, and their rulers were already wearing the trappings of kingship long before the first true Pharaoh is said to have appeared. This is the cradle. This is where the first crown is taking shape. We know the names of some of the rulers who came before Narmer, or who may have come before him, though they stand half in shadow, more rumor than record. There was a figure we call Scorpion, named for the small creature, carved beside his image on a great stone mace head found at Hierakonpolis, a king who seems to be performing a ritual, opening a channel of water with a hoe, surrounded by the signs of power. There were others, figures the scholars call Iri, Hor, and Ka, whose names appear scratched onto pottery and stone in the oldest royal cemetery in the south. These were southern kings, rulers of Upper Egypt, and they were already expanding their reach, already pressing northward, already gathering the threads that Narmer would one day pull tight. Some scholars even believe that Scorpion may have been Narmer's own father, or his immediate predecessor, and a few have wondered whether Scorpion and Narmer might even be the same man under 2 names. We cannot say for certain. We are at the very edge of what can be known, but the shape of it is clear enough. The south was rising, the south was hungry, and out of the south came the man who would finish what the others had begun. No, picture the north, the lower land, the great green delta where the river fanned out toward the sea. It was a different place, wetter, flatter, a world of marshes and reed beds and winding channels, of fowling and fishing, of papyrus growing thick along the water. The north had its own people, its own towns, its own rulers, its own symbols, where the south was associated with a tall white crown, a high pale cap that the kings of Upper Egypt wore. The north was associated with a very different one. A red crown low at the front, and rising in a tall spike at the back, with a curling wire at its center. The white crown of the south, the red crown of the north, 2 crowns for 2 lands, and the dream that hangs over this whole age, the dream that Narmer is remembered for fulfilling, is the dream of placing both of those crowns on a single head. And here we arrive at the man himself, as much as we can know him. His name, written in the oldest Egyptian fashion, is made of 2 picture signs. One is a catfish, the other is a chisel. The Egyptians wrote with images that could stand both for ideas and for sounds. And these 2 signs, read together, give us something close to the sounds nar and mur, and so we call him Narmer. There is debate about exactly how to pronounce it, and even about exactly what it meant. But the catfish and the chisel are his unmistakably, and once you have seen them you can pick him out across the ruins of the early kingdom. To the Egyptians, a name was not a label stuck on from outside. The name was the person, bound up with their very being so closely that to write the name was, in a sense, to summon the one who bore it. And so when we read that fish and that chisel, carved more than 5,000 years ago, we are doing something the Egyptians themselves believed was powerful. We are calling him back, by name out of the dark. What was he like? Here, honestly, we must admit how little we have. We have no portrait we can trust, no body we can examine with certainty, no words he himself spoke or wrote. The early kings did not leave us memoirs. What we have instead are images, a tall, striding figure on carved stone, wearing first one crown and then the other, holding a mace above a fallen enemy, walking in procession behind standards, inspecting the bodies of the slain. We have his name on pottery and on seal impressions and on small ivory labels. We have objects bearing his mark found far from the heart of Egypt, in the deserts and beyond the borders, which tell us his reach was long. From these fragments, scholars have built a picture of a powerful southern king, a warrior and a ruler, who extended his authority over the whole length of the Nile Valley and into the delta of the north, and who came to be remembered by the Egyptians who followed him as the first, the one who stood at the head of the line. And there is one object above all that carries his story, an object we will return to again and again across this long night, because it sits at the very center of everything we believe about him. It is a slab of dark, fine-grained stone, a little over 2 feet tall, shaped something like a shield, carved on both faces, with scenes of a king in triumph. On one side he wears the white crown of the south and raises his mace over a kneeling captive. On the other he wears the red crown of the north and walks in solemn procession past rows of beheaded enemies. And at the top of both faces, framed and protected, is that name, the catfish and the chisel. This is the object we call the Narmer Palette. And for more than 100 years it has been treated as something close to the founding document of Egyptian civilization, the stone on which the union of the 2 lands was first proclaimed. We will look at it closely in time. We will see what it shows, and we will ask what it really means, because that is one of the great quiet arguments of Egyptology. But for now, hold this image in your mind, a single king. Wearing first the white crown and then the red, the 2 lands gathered onto one body, in stone, at the dawn of recorded history. So that is the world, a long green valley fed by a single river. A divided land south and north, valley and delta, white crown and red. A rising southern power, with its falcon city and its half-remembered early kings, and a man named for a fish and a chisel, stepping out of the shadow of prehistory into the first light of the historical record, about to do something that had never been done before. But before we follow him, let us stay in that world a little longer, and let it grow real around us. Because the more clearly you can see the land Narmer was born into, the more clearly you will understand everything he did. So close your eyes, if they are not already closed, and walk with me along the river at the very start of the day. It is just before dawn in Upper Egypt, more than 5,000 years ago. The air is cool, almost cold. the way the desert always is in the hour before sunrise. The Nile lies still and dark, a wide black mirror, and along its banks the reeds stand motionless. Then the sky in the east begins to pale, and the cliffs that wall in the valley turn from gray to rose to pale gold, and the first long light comes sliding across the water. The Egyptians watched this happen every single morning, and to them it was never ordinary. They believed the rising of the sun was a kind of triumph, a return, a daily victory of light over the long darkness, and they wove great stories around it, stories of a figure they called Ra, whom they believed carried the sun across the sky in a boat, sinking each night into a dangerous underworld, and rising again each dawn renewed. We will come to those beliefs, but for now simply notice the feeling of it, that for these people, even the sunrise was charged with meaning. They lived in a world they understood as alive with unseen powers, ordered and threatened and renewed, and the king, the figure at the center of our story, would come to stand at the very heart of that order. Now look around you, in the growing light. On one side of the river, the land is green, astonishingly, almost violently green, a narrow strip of fields and palms and gardens hugging the water. And then, sharply, shockingly, the green simply stops, and the desert begins. The red and tawny land rising into dunes and rock and emptiness as far as the eye can see. There is almost no in-between. The Egyptians lived their whole lives along this knife, edge between the black land of the fields and the red land of the desert, between life and the absence of it, and that contrast shaped the way they saw everything. The green was order, safety, life. The red was danger, the unknown, the edge of the world, and the river was the thread that held it all together. Everything turned on the river's great yearly rhythm. For part of the year the Nile ran low and quiet within its banks. Then, in the heat of summer, fed by rains far to the south that the Egyptians never saw, it began to swell. Slowly at first, then powerfully the water rose, spilling over the banks, flooding out across the fields, drowning the low land under a sheet of slow brown water. The Egyptians watched the level rise with a mixture of hope and fear, for too little flood meant hunger, and too much meant ruin, and a good flood meant life for another year. And then, over the following weeks, the water sank back, retreating into the river, and it left behind everywhere it had touched a fresh skin of dark, rich, damp silt into that soft black earth. The farmers pressed their seed, and the grain came up thick and heavy, and the granaries filled, and there was more than enough. This was the engine of everything. A people who could grow more food than they needed were, a people who could afford to do other things, to build, to organize, to fight, to rule. The surplus of the black earth is what made kings possible. It is what made Narmer possible. And out of that surplus, in the centuries before him, the southern towns had grown rich and crowded and ambitious. Let us go into one of them, the greatest of them, the place the Greeks would call Hierakonpolis, and the Egyptians called Nekhen, the city of the falcon. It sat on the west bank of the Nile in the deep south, and in Narmer's age it was one of the largest and most important towns in all of Egypt, perhaps the most important of all. Its people lived in houses of mud brick, packed close together along narrow lanes. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Potters turned out vessels by the thousand. Craftsmen worked ivory and stone and bone into fine objects. Brewers made beer and bakers made bread, the twin staples of the Egyptian diet, and the smell of both would have hung over the town. And at its heart stood a sacred enclosure, an early temple dedicated to a figure the people of Nekhen revered above all others. A falcon, a soaring hawk that they connected with kingship itself, a figure they called Horus. In their belief, the king on earth was bound up with this falcon, was in some sense its living embodiment. The falcon made flesh and sat upon a throne. Again and again in this story you will meet that falcon perched above the king's name, hovering over his victories, and it always points to the same idea. That, to the Egyptians, the ruler was no ordinary man, but something set apart, something touched by the powers they believed governed the world. It was in this southern world, this rich and crowded and falcon, haunted south, that the first kings began to appear generations before Narmer. We have already met some of them, dim figures at the edge of the record. There was the one we call Scorpion, after the little creature carved beside his image on a great ceremonial mace head that was found, fittingly, at Nekhen itself. On that mace head a king stands in a tall white crown, holding a hoe, performing what looks like a ritual of opening a waterway, or breaking the first earth of a field, or a foundation, surrounded by attendants and standards and the signs of his power. He is plainly a king, plainly a ruler of the south. And he lived not long before Narmer, close enough that some scholars have wondered whether he was Narmer's father, or even whether the two names belonged to a single man. There were others, too. Names scratched onto pottery and carved into stone in the oldest royal graves of the south, at the sacred site of Abydos, figures the scholars call Iri, Hor, and Ka, shadow kings of Upper Egypt who reached northward, who traded and perhaps fought their way toward the delta, who were already gathering the strands that Narmer would one day bind together. This matters, and we will return to it because it tells us that Narmer did not appear out of nothing. He was the heir to a long southern rise, the last and greatest of a line of ambitious kings, the one who reached the summit that the others had been climbing toward. And the reach of these southern kings was already long. This is one of the quietly astonishing things about predynastic Egypt, how far its influence stretched even before there was a unified kingdom. Objects bearing the marks of these early rulers, Narmer's mark among them, have been found far to the south, deep into Nubia, the land beyond the first great cataract of the Nile, and they have been found far to the northeast, beyond the delta, in the lands along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, in sites whose modern names are scattered across the southern Levant. Egyptian pottery, Egyptian ceilings, the unmistakable signs of Egyptian trade and Egyptian power, turning up hundreds of miles from the heart of the Nile Valley. Whether this reach was trade or colonization, or conquest, or some mixture of all three, scholars still debate, but the picture is clear enough. The kings of the south, in Narmer's age, were not isolated chieftains in a backwater. They commanded wealth and craft and organization. They sent expeditions into deserts and across borders. They were reaching out into the wider world, and the man who would unite Egypt was a product of that confident, expanding, hungry southern power. There is one more thing to hold in your mind as we stand here in this ancient world, and it is perhaps the most important of all to the Egyptians. The great task of a king, the very reason a king existed, was to hold back chaos and uphold order. They had a word for that order, that rightness, that proper balance of the world, and the king was its guardian. When the king was strong and the land was united, and the flood came on time and the granaries were full, then order reigned, and the world was as it should be. When the king was weak, or the land was divided, or the flood failed, then disorder crept in, and the Egyptians dreaded it above almost anything. This is the deep meaning beneath the images we will see. The king striking down an enemy, the king wearing both crowns, the king walking in triumph past the bodies of the slain. We may see violence, the Egyptians saw something else. They saw order being established and disorder being driven back. They saw the world being set right, and the unification of the two lands, the joining of south and north under one crown, was the supreme expression of that order. The whole of the land brought into one balanced, harmonious, unified whole, under one ruler who stood as the guardian of all of it. That is the idea that Narmer would come to embody. That is the dream made flesh. So now you can see it whole. The river running north under the hard, bright sky. The thin green ribbon of life pressed between the deserts. The yearly miracle of the flood and the black earth. The crowded southern towns with their potters and brewers and craftsmen. The falcon city of Nekhen with its sacred enclosure. The line of early southern kings reaching northward, gathering power. The wide reach into Nubia and the lands beyond the delta. And over all of it, the great idea that a single king, wearing a single crown, might hold the whole of this land in order, and drive back the chaos that always pressed at its edges. This is the world that made Narmer, and this is the world that Narmer in turn would remake. Hold that single idea as we go forward, because it is the thread that runs through everything that follows. A divided land longing in its own way to be whole. A river that bound it together even as crowns and borders pulled it apart. And a southern king rising at exactly the right moment with exactly the right inheritance, ready to gather the two lands into one, and to place upon his own head the first crown of a united Egypt. Let us follow him now more closely into the heart of his story. So here we are, at the heart of the story. We have walked along the river at dawn. We have stood in the Falcon City. We have met the shadowy kings who came before. Now we turn to the central question of this entire night, the question of how a divided land became one, and how a southern king named for a catfish and a chisel came to be remembered as the first ruler of a united Egypt. This is the deepest part of our journey, so we will move through it slowly, in several stages, circling back as we go, so that even if you drift, you can always find your way again. The thread we are following is simple, even as the details grow complex. Two lands, one king, the first crown. How did it happen? Let us begin with the rise of the man himself, as far as the evidence allows us to reconstruct. Narmer was a king of the south, of Upper Egypt, and his power base lay in that rich southern world we have already explored, in the orbit of the Falcon City of Nekhen and the sacred ground of Abydos and Thinis. He inherited, almost certainly, a kingdom that was already strong, already expanding, already pressing northward. The kings before him, Scorpion, Ka, Eri, Hor, and perhaps others whose names are lost, had spent generations building southern power and reaching toward the delta. Narmer did not start the climb. He finished it. He came to the throne of the south at a moment when the long southern expansion was approaching its climax, and he carried it across the threshold that none before him had crossed. That, at least, is the picture that the Egyptians themselves preserved, and it is the picture that most of the evidence supports. What did the achievement actually look like, in human terms? Imagine a young king taking the throne in the south, in a town of mud-brick walls and narrow lanes, with the falcon enclosure at its heart. He inherits an army, or something we might loosely call an army. Bands of fighting men armed with maces and bows and spears, drawn from the towns and villages under his control. He inherits a treasury swollen by the surplus of the black earth and by the long-distance trade that flowed up and down the river and out into the deserts. He inherits, above all, an idea. The idea already old by his time, that the king of the south might one day rule the whole of the land, north as well as south, valley and delta together, under a single crown, and he sets out to make that idea real. The traditional story, the one told for most of the last century, is a story of conquest. In this telling, Narmer marched north out of Upper Egypt, down the long valley toward the delta, and made war on the kings and chiefs of Lower Egypt. He fought them, he defeated them, he broke their power, and he forced the divided north to bow to a single southern crown. And when it was done, when the last northern resistance had been crushed, he placed upon his own head not only the white crown of the south that was his by right, but also the red crown of the north that he had won by conquest. And so, for the first time in the history of the world, both crowns sat upon a single ruler, and the two lands became one. This is the story carved, as it has long been read, on the famous palette that bears his name. A southern king in his white crown, striking down a northern enemy with his raised mace. The same king, in his red crown, walking in triumph past the bodies of the slain. The Union of Egypt, written in stone as a tale of victory in battle. And there is more to this than the simple drama suggests, because the Union, however it was achieved, was not only a matter of armies. To rule the whole length of the Nile, from the cataracts of the deep south to the marshes of the northern delta, a king needed far more than a victorious army. He needed to govern. He needed officials who could collect the harvest and store it and redistribute it. He needed a way to record what came in and what went out, to track the wealth of a kingdom, that now stretched for hundreds of miles along the river. He needed to bind together peoples who had lived for generations under different rulers, with different local loyalties, and somehow make them feel part of a single realm. And so the unification was not just a battle. It was the beginning of a state, the beginning of administration, of record, keeping of a centralized power that could reach out along the whole river and hold it together. This, in the long run, was the truly revolutionary thing. Not just that one king won a war, but that one king built a machine of government, capable of ruling a vast and varied land as a single whole. Egypt would refine that machine over the following centuries until it became the most sophisticated administration the ancient world had yet seen. And it began here in the work of binding the two lands together. The army wins the land in a season, the administration holds it for 1,000 years. And it is the holding far more than the winning that makes a civilization. Now, let us circle back, because here is where the story grows more interesting and more honest. For a long time, scholars took the tale of conquest at face value. They looked at the palette. They saw a king smiting an enemy. They saw the two crowns. And they concluded that Narmer had united Egypt by force in a single decisive campaign, and that the palette was a kind of war report carved in stone. But over the last several decades, many Egyptologists have grown more cautious, and the picture has become richer and stranger, and it gets stranger the more closely you look. Here is the difficulty. The unification of Egypt, when you examine the full body of evidence rather than a single object, does not look like a single event at all. It looks like a long process. A slow merging of south and north that unfolded over many generations, perhaps over centuries, driven as much by trade and culture and the gradual spread of southern ways as by any single war. Long before Narmer, the material culture of the South, its pottery styles, its artistic motifs, its symbols of power, had been spreading northward into the delta until the two lands were already growing alike in many ways. Long before Narmer, southern kings had been reaching into the north, and the symbols of unification that we see on Narmer's palette, the two crowns, the imagery of a king triumphant over enemies, were not invented by him. Similar images appear on objects that are older than he is, or roughly the same age, suggesting that the idea of the unifying king was already an established theme, a piece of royal stagecraft before Narmer ever picked up his mace. In other words, the palette may not be a snapshot of a real battle on a real day. It may be a statement of an ideal. The king as the one who brings order, who joins the two lands, who triumphs over chaos, an ideal that had been developing for generations, and that Narmer's craftsmen expressed more grandly than anyone before them. So, which is it? Did Narmer conquer the north in a great war, as the old story says? Or did he simply preside over and proclaim the final stage of a long, slow coming together that had been underway for ages? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that the truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps there was real fighting, a real campaign that brought the last of the independent North under Southern control. Perhaps Narmer fought genuine battles against genuine enemies in the Western Delta, as some readings of the palette suggest, even if those battles were not quite the single grand war of legend. And perhaps, at the same time, the deeper unification, the merging of cultures, the binding of the land into a single realm, was the work of many hands across many lifetimes. With Narmer standing at the moment, it crystallized into something we can recognize as the first Egyptian state. This is one of the great quiet debates of Egyptology, and it is worth sitting with because it teaches us something true about the ancient world. The grand simple stories, the single hero, the single battle, the single founding moment, are almost always too simple. The reality is slower, deeper, more human, and in its way more impressive. A whole civilization does not spring from one man's sword. It grows over generations, out of land and river and labor and idea, until at last a figure appears who gives it a name and a face. Narmer is that figure. Whether he won it or inherited it or simply embodied it, he is the one whom both the ancient Egyptians and we ourselves remember as the beginning. So here we are, then, with our king newly risen, the south and north joined under his hand, whether by war or by the slow weight of history or by both. Let us follow what he is said to have done next, because the founding of a kingdom is not finished on the battlefield. It must be built. And the greatest act of building attributed to Narmer, or to the first king of United Egypt under whatever name, is the founding of a city. For when you join two lands that have long been apart, you face an immediate and practical problem. Where do you rule from? The old southern capital lay deep in Upper Egypt, far from the newly won north. To govern the whole land, a king needed a center, a seat of power placed where it could reach both south and north, right at the hinge between the two. And so, according to the tradition that came down to the later Egyptians, and to the Greek writers who recorded it, the first king founded a new city at exactly that hinge, at the apex of the delta, where the narrow valley of the south opens out into the wide fan of the north, where Upper and Lower Egypt meet. He founded it on ground that, the tradition says, he himself reclaimed from the river, by diverting the Nile's course and raising a great barrier to hold back the water and protect the new city. They called it, in its earliest form, the White Walls, Inib Hedjeh, perhaps for the gleaming whitewashed mud brick of its fortifications, and in time this city would grow into one of the most important places in the entire ancient world, a capital that endured for thousands of years, known to history by a later name, Memphis. Picture it for a moment. A king stands at the meeting point of the two lands, at the very seam where south becomes north, and there on ground wrestled from the river itself, he raises the walls of a new capital, white walls, gleaming in the sun, a fortress and a seat of kingship planted exactly where the two halves of Egypt join. It is a profoundly symbolic act. Whether or not every detail of the tradition is literally true, the capital of United Egypt is placed not in the heart of the south, where the king's own power began, but on the boundary between the two lands, as if to say that the king now belongs to both, that he rules the whole, that the union is not the conquest of one half by the other, but the binding of both into a single realm governed from the place where they meet. And the practical wisdom of it is just as striking as the symbolism. From this central seat, a king could watch the south and the north at once, could send his officials and his soldiers up the valley or down into the delta as needed, could control the flow of trade and tribute along the river. Memphis would remain the great administrative heart of Egypt for the better part of 1,000 years, the place where kings were crowned and the affairs of the kingdom were managed, and its founding is remembered as one of the founding acts of Egyptian civilization itself, and it is attributed, in the tradition, to the first king, to Narmer, or to the figure the later Egyptians called by another name, of whom we will say more shortly. Now let us pause and gather ourselves, because we have covered a great deal of ground. So here is where we are. A southern king rises, the heir to generations of southern expansion. He unites the two lands, whether by war or by the slow weight of a process already long underway, and most likely by some combination of the two. He takes the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north, and joins them, in image and in idea, upon a single head, and he founds, at the hinge of the two lands, a new capital, the white walls that would become Memphis, from which the United Kingdom would be ruled for centuries to come. This is the core of what Narmer is remembered for. This is the achievement that placed him at the head of the king lists. This is the first crown. But a king does not stand alone, and a kingdom is not built by one man. So let us turn now to the people around him, and first to the figure who stood closest of all. Beside Narmer, the tradition places a queen, and her name was Nephthotep. We will meet her more fully later in our journey, for she has a remarkable story of her own, but she belongs here too, at the heart of the founding, because her marriage to the first king may have been one of the threads that bound the new kingdom together. Her name itself is revealing. It honors a figure the Egyptians revered, a figure they called Neith, whom they associated with war and with hunting and with weaving, and whose worship was centered in the north, in the delta. A queen who carried that name in her own may well have come from the north, from a powerful northern family, and an old and attractive theory holds that Narmer, the southern conqueror, married a northern princess precisely in order to seal the union of the two lands, joining south and north not only by the sword but by the marriage bed, so that the children of that union would carry the blood of both halves of Egypt. It is a neat and satisfying story, and it may even be true. We should be careful with it because some scholars now argue that Nephthotep herself came from the south rather than the north, and that the tidy tale of the unifying marriage is more romance than fact. But what is not in doubt is that she was a woman of extraordinary rank, that her name appears written in the royal manner usually reserved for kings, and that she was very likely the mother of the king who came next. The first kingdom, in other words, was not the work of a lone man. It was a family enterprise, and at its center stood a king and a queen, and the line that grew from them. For the union, however it was one, had to be made to last, and that is where the true test of Narmer's achievement lay. It is one thing to join two lands in a single lifetime. It is another thing entirely for that union to survive the death of the man who made it. And here we come to one of the most important facts in the whole story, a fact that is easy to overlook, but that changes everything. Narmer's union did last. It did not collapse when he died. It passed to his successor, and then to the next, and the next, and on down a line of kings that we now call the First Dynasty. A dynasty is precisely this, a succession of rulers from a single line, the throne passing down within a family across the generations. And the throne of United Egypt passed down, after Narmer, to a king we call Hariaha, whose name means something like the fighting falcon, and who was very likely Narmer's own son, the child of Nephthotep. After Aha came others, Dirshur and Dejet, and a remarkable queen named Mernith, who seems to have ruled in her own right or as regent, and then Den and others after him, down to the end of the First Dynasty. We will follow them in time. But the crucial point is this. The thing Narmer began did not die with him. It became permanent. It became Egypt. And it gets stranger in the best way. The more you consider what that means, most of what one man does in a single lifetime fades within a generation or two. Kingdoms rise and fall. Conquests are undone. The work of the strongest ruler is so often unstitched by his heirs. But here, at the very dawn of recorded history, something took hold that simply would not let go. The union of the two lands, once made, became the deep underlying assumption of Egyptian existence for the next 3,000 years. Even in the ages when Egypt later fractured and fell into division, the dream of the united land, the two lands joined under one crown, remained the ideal toward which everything strained, the proper state of the world to which Egypt always longed to return. Every pharaoh who came after for 3,000 years wore titles and symbols that proclaimed him the lord of the two lands, the uniter of south and north, the wearer of both crowns. They were all, in a sense, repeating Narmer. They were all standing in the place he first defined. The boy King Tutankhamun, dazzling in his gold, the great builder Ramesses, the last Queen Cleopatra. All of them, across the whole vast span of Egyptian history, were heirs to the single idea that took shape in Narmer's hands. The two lands are one. The king holds them both. That is what it means to rule Egypt. And that idea, that founding assumption, outlived its maker by 30 centuries. So let that settle for a moment. We began this section with a simple question. How did a divided land become one, and how did a southern king named for a fish and a chisel come to be remembered as the first? And now you can see the shape of the answer. He rose at the climax of a long southern expansion. He united the two lands, by war or by the weight of a long process, or by both together. He joined the white crown and the red. He founded a capital at the hinge of the kingdom. He took a queen who may have helped bind the union, and he fathered, in all likelihood, the line that carried it forward. And the thing he made did not die. It became the permanent foundation of one of the longest-lived civilizations the world has ever known. Now let us slow down and look, with our own eyes, at the single object that carries more of this story than any other. The great carved palette that bears Narmer's name for it is, in a sense, his portrait, his record, and his proclamation all at once. We have spoken of it in passing. Now let us stand before it in the lamplight and read it. Scene by scene, the way the Egyptians meant it to be read, it is carved from a single piece of dark, smooth, greenish gray stone, a little over 2 feet in height, shaped like a shield or a shallow shield, bearing chevron narrowing toward the top. Both of its faces are covered in carved scenes, and the fact that both sides are decorated tells us at once that this was no everyday object palettes. In ordinary life were used for grinding the minerals that the Egyptians made into eye paint, and such everyday palettes were carved on one side only. This one, carved on both sides with the greatest care, was something far grander, a ceremonial object made to be set up in a temple, made to declare something for all time. Turn it so the smaller, more crowded face is toward you. At the very top, on both faces, sits the king's name, the catfish, and the chisel, enclosed in a tall rectangular frame called a serac, a frame that represented the palace, the royal house, so that to write the king's name within it was to say, "This is the king, the lord of the palace, the ruler." And on either side of that frame, watching over it, are 2 faces of a horned figure, the Egyptians revered, a figure with a human face and the ears and horns of a cow, gazing out at us across 5,000 years. Below the name, the upper register of this face shows the king himself, but smaller now, walking in a great procession. He wears the red crown of the north, the low crown with its tall rising back and its curling wire, and he walks behind a row of standard bearers, men carrying tall poles topped with emblems, the banners of his followers and his territories. He is going to inspect something terrible. For there, at the right of the scene, lie rows of enemies, defeated and slain, their heads placed neatly between their feet, a stark and brutal image of total victory. The king, in the crown of the north, walks in triumph among the bodies of the conquered. Below that, in the central band of this face, 2 strange long-necked beasts are shown with their necks entwined, their necks crossing to form a circle in the very center of the palette, the hollow that, on an everyday palette, would have held the eye paint. Scholars have argued for over a century about what these intertwined creatures mean. Some see in them the 2 lands themselves, south and north, bound together, their necks crossed and joined into a single whole, the very image of unification. And at the bottom of this face, a powerful bull, which stands for the king, tramples an enemy beneath its feet and breaks down the wall of a fortified town with its horns. The king is a raging bull, smashing the strongholds of his foes. Now turn the palette over to the larger, simpler, more powerful face, the face that has become one of the most famous images in all of ancient art. Here the king is huge, towering over everyone else, for in Egyptian art, the most important figure is always the largest, and there is no one more important than the king. He wears the tall white crown of the south. He strides forward with 1 foot advanced, and in his raised right hand he grips a great mace, swung back and ready to fall. With his other hand he seizes a kneeling enemy by the hair, a man helpless before him, about to be struck down. This is the smiting scene, the image of the king destroying his foe, and it is the single most enduring image of Egyptian kingship ever created. For 3,000 years after this, on temple walls, the length of the Nile, pharaohs would be shown in exactly this pose, towering. Mace-raised enemy gripped by the hair, repeating. Again and again, across the whole span of Egyptian history, the gesture that Narmer's craftsmen carved here at the very beginning. Above the falling enemy, the falcon figure the Egyptians called Horus perches upon a clump of papyrus plants, and from those plants a human head emerges, held captive by the falcon's grasp. The papyrus was the plant of the north, the delta, and so the image says in the picture, language of the time, that the king, with the falcon's blessing, has taken captive the people of the north. Behind the king stands a small figure carrying his sandals, a servant, an attendant, and beneath his feet lie sprawled the bodies of more fallen enemies. The whole face is a single overwhelming statement. The king of the south, in his white crown, blessed by the falcon, strikes down the north and takes it captive. And there it is, the two faces together. On one side the king in the red crown of the north, walking in triumph among the slain. On the other, the king in the white crown of the south, striking down a northern foe. The two crowns, the two lands, the two halves of Egypt, gathered onto a single object and a single ruler. This is why the palette has been called the founding document of Egypt, the birth certificate of a nation, the first page of recorded Egyptian history, whether it records a single real battle or proclaims a long developing ideal. The message it carries could not be clearer. One king, both crowns, the land made whole. And it carries his name at the top of both faces, the catfish and the chisel, so that there is no doubt whose triumph this is. There is a second great object from Narmer's reign that we should set beside the palette, for it deepens the picture, and it too was found in the falcon city of Nekhen. It is a large ceremonial mace head of stone, carved with another crowded scene. Here the king sits enthroned beneath a canopy, raised on a high platform reached by steps, wearing the red crown of the north, wrapped in a long cloak, attended by fan-bearers and standard-bearers and running figures. Before him are shown enclosures, and within them animals, cattle and goats, and a single human figure, perhaps a captive, perhaps a person of importance. And beside the scene are numbers, written in the early Egyptian way, that seem to record an enormous count. Hundreds of thousands of cattle, hundreds of thousands of goats, vast numbers of captive people. Scholars debate what the mace head shows. Some believe it records the spoils and the prisoners taken in the king's northern campaign, a great tally of plunder. Others believe it shows a royal festival, perhaps even a royal wedding, the king enthroned in state on a day of celebration, with the numbers representing not captives, but the wealth and the offerings gathered for the occasion. We cannot be certain, but either way, the mace head shows us the king in a different aspect. Not in the act of striking, but in the act of ruling. Seated in majesty, receiving the wealth of the land, presiding over his people from a high throne. The palette shows us the warrior. The mace head shows us the sovereign. Together, they give us the fullest picture we have of what it meant to be the first king of Egypt. Let us turn now to that warfare itself. Because if there was indeed fighting in the making of the Union, it is worth pausing to imagine what war looked like in this age. More than 5,000 years ago, there were no horses in Egypt yet, no chariots. Those would come more than 1,000 years later. There was no iron. The metal of the day was copper, soft and precious, and most weapons were still made of stone and wood. The great weapon of the king, the weapon we see in his hand on the palette, was the mace, a heavy rounded head of polished stone fixed to a wooden handle, a weapon for crushing and breaking, swung down upon an enemy with terrible force. The fighting men carried bows of wood and arrows tipped with flint and spears and clubs, and shields of hide stretched over wooden frames. They went on foot, or they moved by boat along the river. For the Nile was the great highway of Egypt, and an army could be carried swiftly up or down its length by water. We see boats again and again in the art of this age, and it is likely that Narmer's forces, and those of the kings before him, moved north along the river in fleets, striking at the towns of the delta from the water. Battle, when it came, would have been close and brutal bands of men with stone and copper and wood, fighting hand to hand along the riverbanks and at the walls of mud-brick towns. There were no vast armies in the later sense, no professional soldiers drilled by the thousand. There were the king and his followers, the men sworn to him, the bands raised from the towns under his control, and with them he made himself master of the land. And around the king there was a special company, a body of men the later Egyptians remembered with a striking name, the followers of Horus, the companions of the Falcon King. Whether this was a real institution in Narmer's day, or a memory shaped by later ages, it points to something real about early kingship, that the king moved through his land surrounded by a band of loyal followers, attendants and warriors and standard-bearers, the human core of his power, the men who carried his banners and enforced his will. We see them on the palette, marching behind the king with their tall standards. They are the first court, the first royal household, the seed from which the whole apparatus of Egyptian government would grow. For here is something we must not lose sight of. Amid the drama of crowns and battles, the truly lasting achievement of the first king was not the war. It was the state, to rule the whole length of the Nile. A king needed to govern, and to govern he needed to count, to record, to organize. And it is exactly in Narmer's age that we see the birth of the tools that made such government possible. Above all, the birth of writing. The signs on the palette and the mace head, the catfish and the chisel of the king's name, the numbers tallying the cattle and the captives, the labels naming places and goods. These are among the very earliest writing known anywhere in Egypt, perhaps among the earliest writing anywhere in the world. Writing did not begin as poetry or as story. It began as a tool of power and accounting, a way to record who owned what, who owed what came into the royal storehouses and what went out. The first king ruling a newly united land needed to know the wealth of his kingdom, and so his scribes learned to mark it down. Small labels of bone and ivory have survived from this earliest age, pierced so they could be tied to jars and boxes, marked with the king's name and with signs recording the contents and perhaps the year. These humble tags are, in their way, as remarkable as the Great Palette, for they are the first stirrings of the administration that would in time govern Egypt for 3,000 years. The king's name itself, sealed within its seric, became a tool of rule, stamped onto ceilings that closed jars and storerooms and tombs, marking the property and the authority of the crown across the whole length of the land. So picture, now, the full shape of a reign. A king rises in the south, the heir to generations of expansion. He gathers his followers and his fleets and his bands of fighting men, and he extends his power down the river into the north by war, or by pressure, or by the slow weight of a union already half made. He joins the two crowns, the white and the red, upon his own head. He founds a capital at the hinge of the two lands, gleaming white walls raised on ground, taken from the river. He takes a queen who may have helped bind the realm together, and he fathers the line that will carry it forward. He surrounds himself with a household, the followers of the falcon, the first court, and he sets his scribes to the work of counting and recording, planting the seed of the great administration to come. He stamps his name, the catfish and the chisel, onto the ceilings and the labels that flow through his storehouses, so that across the whole united land, from the cataracts of the south to the marshes of the north, men handle objects marked with the sign of the one king. This is what it meant to be the first. Not merely to win a war, but to invent. In the doing, the very idea of a single Egyptian state, and his reach, even in his own lifetime, stretched far beyond the borders of the land he had united. This is one of the quiet surprises of the evidence. Objects bearing Narmer's name, his catfish and chisel sealed within the seric, have been found not only the length of the Nile Valley, but far beyond it. They have turned up in the deep south, in Nubia, beyond the first great cataract, and they have turned up to the northeast, beyond the delta, in the lands along the eastern Mediterranean, in a scattering of ancient sites across the southern Levant, where Narmer's seric appears on pottery and fragments brought there by trade or carried by Egyptian expeditions. What this means, scholars still debate. Some see evidence of trade alone, Egyptian goods flowing along established routes to distant markets. Others see something more, Egyptian outposts, perhaps, or campaigns, or a network of influence reaching out from the newly united kingdom into the wider world. But the simple fact is striking enough on its own. In the very first generation of a united Egypt, the name of its first king was already traveling hundreds of miles beyond its borders, carried on the goods and the expeditions of a kingdom that, almost as soon as it was born, was reaching outward. The first crown was not the crown of an isolated valley. It was the crown of a power that touched lands far away, even at the dawn of its existence. A king who, in a single lifetime, had joined two lands into one and sent his name out across the wider world. That is a reach almost without parallel in so early an age, and it tells us that the first king of Egypt was, from the very start, a ruler whose horizons extended far beyond the green ribbon of his own river. For the later Egyptians, and the Greek writers who learned from them, did not always call the first king Narmer. They called him by another name entirely. We have been speaking all this while, as though we are certain of who he was and what to call him. And here we must be honest with one another, because the question of his name is far from settled, and the tangle of those names leads us into the wider story that surrounds him. The story we turn to next. So here we are, back at the edge of the great puzzle, and the puzzle is this. The Egyptians who came long after Narmer, and the Greek writers who learned from them, did not call the first king of Egypt by the name we use. They called him Menes. And the relationship between Narmer and Menes is one of the longest-running and most fascinating arguments in all of Egyptology. A knot of names and king lists and ancient memory that has never been fully untied. To understand Narmer, we have to step back and look at the wider story that surrounds him. The other names, the other kings. The long chain of memory that carried him down to us, and the people who stood around him at the dawn of the kingdom. So let us widen our view, gently, and take in the world that gives Narmer his meaning begun with the name Menes. It comes to us through the Greek writers, through Herodotus, the great traveler and historian who visited Egypt and recorded what the priests told him, and through Manetho, an Egyptian priest who lived centuries later under Greek rule and who wrote a history of Egypt in the Greek language, organizing its kings into the dynasties we still use today. Both of them named the first king of a united Egypt as Menes. Both credited him with joining the two lands and founding the line of kings, and both placed him at the very beginning, the founder the first. The name Menes seems to mean something like the one who endures, the lasting one, a fitting name for a founder. But here is the difficulty. The name Menes does not appear in the earliest records, the records from Narmer's own age. In those earliest records, the seal impressions, the labels, the inscriptions from the first kings themselves, the name we find at the head of the line is Narmer, so we have two beginnings. The contemporary evidence, the evidence from the time itself, points to Narmer. The later tradition, the memory preserved across thousands of years and recorded by the Greeks, points to Menes. How do we reconcile them? This is where the great Egyptologists have argued for more than a century, and the most widely accepted answer was offered long ago by the famous British archaeologist who did so much to uncover early Egypt, William Matthew Flinders Petrie. His solution was elegant. Narmer and Menes, he proposed, were the same man. Narmer was his name in the ordinary sense, the name he was given, the name carved as a catfish and a chisel. Menes, the one who endures, was a kind of honorific, a title of the founder, the name by which later ages remembered him, two names for one king. The contemporary records use his given name, Narmer. The later tradition uses his title of honor, Menes, and both point to the same man, the first king, the uniter of the two lands. This is the view that most Egyptologists have leaned toward, and there is real evidence for it. On one small ivory label found at Nakada, the name Narmer appears alongside a sign that some read as men, means as though connecting the two, and there are seal impressions found in the tombs of later First Dynasty kings that list the kings of the dynasty in order. And these lists begin with Narmer. If the dynasty's own kings remembered Narmer as their founder, and the later tradition remembered Menes as the founder, the simplest explanation is that Narmer and Menes are one. And it gets more tangled still because there is a third name in the knot. Hor, Aha, the king who came immediately after Narmer, very likely his son. Some scholars have argued that it was actually Hor, Aha, not Narmer, who should be identified with the legendary Menes, that Narmer began the work of unification and Hor. Aha completed it, and that it was Hor, Aha, the completer, whom later ages remembered as the founding Menes. And there is yet a fourth shadow in the puzzle, the figure of Scorpion, that earlier southern king whose mace head was found at Nikon. A growing number of scholars have wondered whether Scorpion and Narmer might be the same man under different names, or whether Scorpion was Narmer's immediate predecessor who began the unification that Narmer finished. Names upon names, kings upon kings, all of them clustered at the very dawn of Egyptian history, all of them entangled in the single great question: who, truly, was the first? The honest answer, once again, is that we cannot be certain, and that the very difficulty is part of the story. We are standing at the precise moment when history emerges from prehistory, when the first written names appear out of the silence, and at that boundary everything is blurred. The early kings did not leave us clear and complete records. They left us scattered objects, fragmentary inscriptions, names half read and half understood. And the later Egyptians, looking back across 1,000 years and more, remembered their founders through a haze of tradition, mixing memory and legend, sometimes confusing one early king with another, sometimes merging several figures into a single legendary founder. What we can say with confidence is this: the contemporary evidence places Narmer at the head of the first dynasty, the earliest king whose name the dynasty's own records honor as the founder. Whether he is the same as the legendary Menes, whether he completed the union or began it, whether Scorpion was his father or his earlier self, these questions remain open and they may never be fully closed. But Narmer stands at the threshold. Of that, the evidence is clear. Now let us turn from the names to the people, for Narmer did not stand alone, and the wider story of his reign is the story of the kingdom he founded and the line that grew from him. We have already met his queen, Neithotep, and she deserves a fuller place in the story, for she was no mere shadow beside the king. Her name appears written in the royal Serach, the frame normally reserved for kings, which tells us at once that she held a rank of extraordinary power. Her tomb, when it was found, was so large and so grand that the archaeologists who first uncovered it assumed it must belong to a king, and for a time they searched for the name of an unknown male ruler among its inscriptions before they understood that this enormous monument belonged to a woman. She may have been Narmer's wife, brought perhaps from a powerful family to help bind the union of the two lands. She was very likely the mother of the next king, and some recent evidence even suggests she may have lived on into the reign of a later king as a kind of regent, a woman of power steering the young kingdom through its earliest and most fragile years. She stands at the very beginning of a remarkable Egyptian tradition, the tradition of royal women who held real power, who ruled as regents for young sons, who in a few extraordinary cases ruled as monarchs in their own right. That tradition begins here, in the first dynasty, with Neithotep at the head of it. And from Narmer and Neithotep, the line ran on. The next king was Horah, the fighting falcon, very likely their son, who took the throne of the United Kingdom and held it. The fact that the throne passed smoothly from father to son is itself a quiet triumph, for it means the union survived its founder, which is the hardest test any new order must pass. Horah's reign is better documented than Narmer's. We have labels and inscriptions and a tomb, and we can see the young kingdom continuing to organize itself, to record, to build. After Horah came Djer, and after Djer came Djet, and the first dynasty rolled on. And in the middle of it stands another remarkable woman, a queen named Merneith, who seems to have ruled as regent for her young son, and whose tomb was built on the scale of a king's, complete with all the marks of royal power. For a time, scholars were unsure whether Merneith was a king or a queen, just as they had been unsure about Neithotep, until the evidence revealed her as a woman of supreme authority who governed the kingdom in her son's name. Then came Den, perhaps the greatest of the first dynasty kings, whose long reign saw the kingdom flourish, and who was the first to be shown wearing the double crown. The white and the red combined into a single crown, the visible symbol of the two lands made one. The very crown that proclaimed the union, the double crown that every later pharaoh would wear, takes its clear form here. A few reigns after Narmer, as the kingdom he founded matured and grew confident in itself. So the wider story of Narmer is the story of a dynasty, the first dynasty of Egypt, a line of kings and powerful queens who carried forward the union he made and built upon it the foundations of the Egyptian state. We can follow them through their tombs, clustered together in the sacred ground of Abydos in the deep south, the ancestral burial place of the southern kings from whom Narmer sprang. There, in the desert beyond the cultivation, the first kings of Egypt were laid to rest, one after another, in tombs of mud brick, surrounded by storerooms packed with goods for the afterlife, and around them, in many cases, the graves of servants and retainers who seemed to have been buried at the same time, accompanying their king into death. This is one of the more sobering discoveries of early Egyptian archaeology, that in the very earliest dynasties, when a king died, members of his household may have been put to death and buried around him to serve him in the next life as they had served him in this one. The practice did not last. Within a few generations it was abandoned, replaced by models and images of servants rather than the servants themselves. But in the time of Narmer and the kings just after him, the evidence suggests that real human beings followed their king into the grave. It is a stark reminder of how absolute the power of these first kings had become, and how completely the Egyptians believed in the continuation of life beyond death. Let us widen the view once more, to take in the religious and ceremonial world that surrounded the first king, for it is essential to understanding what kingship meant. The Egyptians did not see their king as merely a powerful man. They saw him as something set apart, a figure who stood at the meeting point of the human world and the world of the unseen powers they revered. We have spoken of the falcon, the figure they called Horus, with whom the living king was identified. The king was, in their understanding, the falcon made flesh, the earthly presence of that soaring power, and so the king's chief role, beyond war and government, was a sacred one. It was the king who maintained the proper order of the world, who performed the rituals that the Egyptians believed kept the cosmos in balance, who stood as the guarantor that the sun would rise and the flood would come and the land would be fruitful. When we see Narmer on his palette, striking down the enemy, we should not see only a warlord, we should see, as the Egyptians saw, the guardian of order driving back the forces of chaos, performing, in the act of conquest, a kind of sacred duty. This fusion of the political and the sacred, the king as both ruler and holy figure, was one of the deepest and most enduring features of Egyptian civilization, and it takes shape here at the beginning in the figure of the first king. And the king's role as builder belongs to this sacred world too. The first kings began the tradition of building shrines and temples to the figures their people revered, of endowing them with offerings, of marking the land with monuments to the powers that ordered it. The falcon city of Nakan, where Narmer's great palette and mace head were found, was a sacred center, a place where the early kings made offerings and set up their ceremonial objects. The grand objects we have examined were not made to decorate a palace. They were made to be dedicated in a temple, offered up in the sacred enclosure of the falcon, as gifts and as proclamations, so that the powers the Egyptians revered and the people who came to worship would know what the king had done. This is why the palette and the mace head survived at all, because they were placed in a sacred deposit, buried in the temple grounds, where they lay undisturbed for thousands of years, until the archaeologists found them. The first king's monuments to the unseen powers are the very objects that preserved his memory for us. So the wider story comes full circle. Around Narmer stands a whole world, the tangle of names and the long argument over who was truly first, the powerful queen at his side, and the line of kings and queens who followed him, the dynasty buried together in the sacred ground of Abydos, the dark practice of the retainer burials, the fusion of king and sacred figure that defined Egyptian kingship, and the temples and offerings through which the first kings reached toward the powers they revered. All of it grows out of the single act at the center of our story, the joining of the two lands under one crown. Narmer is the seed. The first dynasty, the Egyptian state, the whole towering edifice of pharaonic civilization, is the tree that grew from it. Let us widen the view further still, for there is a question that hangs over all of this. How did the Egyptians themselves keep the memory of Narmer and the first kings alive across so many centuries? The answer is that they were, from very early on, a people who kept lists. They cared deeply about the order of their kings, about the chain of succession reaching back to the founder, and they wrote that chain down again and again across their long history. The earliest of these records is a remarkable object known as the Palermo stone, named for the city in Italy where its largest surviving fragment is now kept. It is a slab of hard black stone carved many centuries after Narmer, during the period of the Great Pyramid builders, and on it the Egyptians recorded a year account of their earliest kings. The kings before the unification shown wearing the crowns of the divided land, and then the kings of the United Kingdom, reign by reign, with notes on the great events of each year and even records of the height of the Nile flood. The Palermo stone is broken, only fragments survive, and much of it is lost. But it shows us that within a few centuries of Narmer, the Egyptians already possessed a sophisticated sense of their own history, a record of kings stretching back to the very beginning, and back even before the beginning, into the age of the divided land. Their history did not start with vague legend. It started with lists, carefully kept, and the lists continued. Across thousands of years, in the great age of the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after Narmer, kings still recorded the line of their predecessors. On the wall of a temple at Abydos, the king Seti I, father of the famous Ramesses, set up a long list of the kings who had come before him, row upon row of royal names, with his young son beside him, honoring the ancestors who had held the throne of Egypt back to the founding. On that list, the first name is given as Menes, not Narmer. Another great list, written in cursive script on a papyrus now known as the Turin King List, likewise begins the line of human kings with Menes. So the later Egyptians, looking back across more than 1,000 years, named their founder Menes and built him into the official memory of the kingdom, while the contemporary records of Narmer's own time named the founder Narmer. This is the very heart of the puzzle we explored earlier, and now you can see how it arose, two streams of memory. The contemporary and the traditional, flowing down the centuries side by side, one carrying the name Narmer, and the other, the name Menes, until they meet in the hands of modern scholars, who must decide whether they describe one man or two. The simplest and most widely held answer remains Petrie's, that they are one man, known by a given name and a name of honor. But the lists themselves are a marvel, quite apart from the puzzle they pose. They show a civilization obsessed with continuity, with the unbroken chain of kingship reaching back across the ages to the single founder who first joined the two lands. The Egyptians, in other words, never forgot that they had a beginning, and never forgot, however dimly, the man who stood at it. And it is worth pausing on what the Greek traveler Herodotus, writing his great history in the 5th century before the Common Era, was told about that founder when he visited Egypt. The priests, he recorded, said that the first king of Egypt, whom they called Menes, had founded the city of Memphis at the meeting point of the two lands, and that to do so he had first tamed the river itself, raising a great embankment to turn the Nile aside and reclaim the dry ground on which the city was built. Then, digging channels and basins to manage the water around it. Whether every detail is true, we cannot say. Herodotus wrote down what the priests told him nearly 3,000 years after the events, and tradition had surely reshaped the story over that immense span. But the core of it matches the contemporary picture of Narmer remarkably well. A founding king, a new capital at the hinge of the two lands, a mastery of the river that gave Egypt its life. Across thousands of years, through the mouths of priests and the pens of foreign travelers, the memory of the first king's great work survived, battered and blurred but still recognizable, still pointing back to the same essential truth. A king had united the land. A king had founded the capital. A king had stood at the beginning. Now let us widen the view one final time to take in the world beyond Egypt's borders. For Narmer's kingdom did not arise in isolation. Far to the northeast, in the land between the great rivers that we call Mesopotamia, another of the world's first civilizations was rising at almost exactly the same time. The cities of the south of that land, places like Uruk, were growing into the first true cities the world had ever seen. with their own kings, their own temples, and their own newly invented writing. It is one of the great wonders of human history that two of the earliest civilizations on Earth, the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian, were taking shape in the very same centuries, each along its own great river, each inventing writing and kingship and monumental building more or less independently. And there are tantalizing hints that the two worlds touched. On Narmer's own palette, those two strange long-necked beasts with their entwined necks have close cousins in the art of Mesopotamia, where similar creatures appear on carved seals. Certain other motifs of early Egyptian art, certain ways of building, certain artistic conventions have reminded scholars of Mesopotamian models. Some have argued that ideas, perhaps even the spark of writing itself, traveled from Mesopotamia to Egypt along the trade routes, carried by merchants and travelers across the deserts and seas that lay between. Others insist that Egypt developed its writing and its art on its own, drawing at most a few decorative motifs from contact with the East. The debate continues, and the truth is probably complex, that Egypt was its own creation, born of the Nile and the people who lived along it, but that it was not sealed off from the wider world, that ideas and goods and images flowed across the ancient Near East, even in this earliest age. Narmer's Egypt was one of two great lights kindling at the same moment in the darkness of prehistory, and the two may well have glimpsed each other across the distance. Two rivers, two peoples, two of the first civilizations on Earth, rising together at the dawn of the human record, and somewhere between them, faint threads of contact, a shared motif on a carved stone, a hint that even at the very beginning, the world was more connected than we tend to imagine. And what of the kingdom Narmer founded in the generations after him? How did it grow? How did it deepen? This too is part of the wider story. For the achievement of Narmer was not a single moment, but the beginning of a long maturing. The first dynasty kings who followed him did not merely hold the union together, they built upon it. They developed the administration, dividing the land into provinces, each with its officials answering to the crown, so that the king's authority could reach into every corner of the realm. They refined the system of writing, so that by the end of the first dynasty the Egyptians could record not just names and numbers but events, ceremonies, the affairs of the kingdom. They developed the calendar, tying the year to the great rhythm of the Nile flood, and to the rising of a particular bright star that returned each year just before the waters came. One of the earliest and most accurate calendars the ancient world would know. They expanded the trade routes, sending expeditions into the deserts for stone and gold and precious materials, and out into Nubia and the lands of the northeast. They refined the rituals of kingship, the great ceremonies in which the king renewed his power and reaffirmed his hold over the two lands. Step by step, reign by reign, the rough new kingdom of Narmer matured into the sophisticated state that would, only a few centuries later, raise the pyramids. None of it would have been possible without the foundation Narmer laid. He did not build the pyramids, but he built the kingdom that would build them. He is the first stone in a foundation that would rise in time into the greatest monuments the ancient world ever made. So when we speak of Narmer, we are not speaking only of one man and one reign. We are speaking of the beginning of a continuous tradition of kingship that would endure with interruptions and revivals. For 3,000 years, longer than the entire span of time that separates us from Narmer's own successors, we are speaking of the first chapter of a story that runs from the catfish and the chisel all the way down to the last of the pharaohs. And we are speaking of a memory so durable that the Egyptians kept it in their lists and their temples and their traditions across that entire vast span, never quite letting go of the knowledge that once, at the dawn of their world, a king had joined the two lands and made them one. There is one more wonder from the world of the first kings that deserves a place in this wider story, because it shows us, more vividly than almost anything else, how grand and how strange the funerary world of early Egypt already was. Out at Abydos, in the desert near where the first kings were buried, archaeologists found not only the royal tombs but a second set of monuments standing some distance away. great rectangular enclosures of mud brick, their walls once towering and brilliantly whitewashed, vast empty courts that seemed to have served as funerary palaces, places where the rituals of the dead king were performed. And buried in the sand beside one of these enclosures, the diggers found something almost unbelievable: a fleet of boats, real boats, full-sized wooden vessels, each laid in its own grave of mud brick, lined up side by side in the desert, far from the river, buried so that the king might have them in the next life. These are among the oldest built boats ever found anywhere in the world, and they were placed there at the very dawn of the kingdom, in the time of the first kings, the immediate world of Narmer and his successors. Imagine it: a row of wooden ships, sealed in the sand of the desert more than 5,000 years ago, waiting in the dark for a king to sail them through eternity. The Egyptians believed so completely in the journey beyond death that they buried a whole fleet to carry their king upon it. That is the world Narmer founded. That is the depth of belief and wealth and ambition that gathered around the first kings of the United Land. So when we speak of Narmer, we speak of the founder of all of this. The lists, the temples, the dynasty, the funerary palaces, the buried fleet, the whole vast machinery of kingship and belief that rose along the Nile. He is the beginning of a tradition so rich that, within a few generations of his death, his successors were burying ships in the desert and raising white-walled palaces for the dead, and within a few centuries raising mountains of stone that still stand today. Everything that we think of as ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the temples, the painted tombs, the long line of pharaohs, rests upon the foundation that this one obscure southern king first laid down. But how do we know any of this? How do we reach back 5,000 years and speak of a man and his crown and his queen and his city with any confidence at all? That question, the question of the evidence of how the buried past was recovered and what it can and cannot tell us, is the next stage of our journey. Let us turn to the diggers, the scholars, the objects in the sand, and the strange and humbling things they have revealed. So how do we know him at all? How is it that we can speak, across 5,000 years, of a king named for a catfish and a chisel, of his crowns and his city and his queen and his dynasty? The answer lies in the patient, dusty, often heartbreaking work of the people who dug him out of the sand. The archaeologists and scholars who, over the last century and a half, recovered the lost world of early Egypt from beneath the desert. Let us turn now to them, and to the objects they found, and to the strange and humbling things those objects have taught us. So settle deeper, and let us walk into the story of the discovery. It begins in the closing years of the 1800s. At the Falcon city of Nekhen, the place the Greeks called Hierakonpolis, deep in the south of Egypt, two British archaeologists, James Quibell and Frederick Green, were excavating the ruins of the ancient temple there, digging through the layers of a sacred site that had been in use for thousands of years. And in the temple grounds they came upon something the Egyptians had done with their oldest and most precious objects. They had gathered them up, perhaps when the temple was being rebuilt or reorganized, and buried them together in a sacred cache, a deposit of holy things too sacred to throw away. Among the objects in that deposit, lying in the earth where it had rested for 50 centuries, was a slab of dark greenish stone, a little over 2 feet tall, carved on both faces with the figure of a king. It was the Narmer Palette, and near it lay the great ceremonial mace head, also carved with the king and other early treasures besides. In the space of a single excavation in the 1890s, two diggers had pulled from the ground the single most important object for understanding the birth of Egypt, an object that would become, in time, one of the most studied and most famous artifacts in the entire history of archaeology. It now rests in the Great Egyptian Museum, and scholars have been arguing over it ever since. Think for a moment about how close we came to never having it at all. The palette survived because the Egyptians, thousands of years ago, treated it as sacred and buried it carefully in their temple. Had they not done so, it would almost certainly have been lost, broken up, ground down, scattered, dissolved into the anonymous dust of the ages, Like so much else from that distant time, the whole of our clearest window onto the founding of Egypt hangs on the accident that a group of ancient priests chose to bury their old sacred objects rather than discard them, and on the further accident that two archaeologists, thousands of years later, happened to dig in exactly the right place. So much of what we know about the deep past hangs on such slender threads. So much else, we must always remember, was lost. While Quibel and Green were working in the south at the Falcon City, another archaeologist was beginning work that would transform our understanding of the first kings, William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the towering and difficult figure who is often called the father of scientific archaeology in Egypt. Before Petrie, much excavation in Egypt had been little more than treasure hunting, a frantic search for beautiful objects with little care for where exactly they were found, or what lay around them. Petrie changed that. He insisted on recording everything, on noting the precise position of every find, on paying attention to the humble potsherds that others threw away, because he understood that the pattern of ordinary objects could be used to work out the sequence of the ages, which things were older, which were younger, how the styles changed over time. At the royal cemetery of Abydos, where the first kings of Egypt were buried, Petrie re-excavated tombs that an earlier and rougher digger had already torn through. And by his careful methods he recovered the names and the order of the earliest kings, Narmer's dynasty, from the wreckage. It was Petrie who pieced together much of the framework we still use. Petrie who argued that Narmer and the legendary Menes were the same man. Petrie who gave the study of early Egypt its first real scientific foundation. The recovery of Narmer is, in large part, the achievement of this one relentless, brilliant, exacting man. The royal tombs at Abydos lie in a stretch of desert the local people called el Quab, which means something like the mother of pots, named for the countless fragments of pottery that litter the ground. The broken remains of offerings left by pilgrims over thousands of years. For the Egyptians of later ages came to believe that one of these early tombs was the burial place of a figure they revered above all, in connection with the afterlife, the one they called Osiris, and they came in their thousands to leave offerings there. Among the tombs at el Quab, scholars identified the burial places of the first dynasty kings, one after another: Hor, Aha, Djer, Jet, the Queen Mernith, Den, and the others. And there, too, they sought the tomb of Narmer himself. In the 1960s, the German Egyptologist Werner Kaiser, working with the German Archaeological Institute in Cairo, studied the cemetery anew and identified an inscription bearing Narmer's name, and a pair of joined chambers known to scholars by the plain labels B17 and B18 came to be accepted as the probable tomb of the first king. They are modest by the standards of what would come later. Two simple chambers of mud brick, nothing like the mountains of stone that Narmer's distant successors would raise. But if the identification is right, this is the resting place of the man who united Egypt. And here we come to one of the quiet frustrations of this whole story, one of the places where the evidence falls silent. We are not entirely certain that those chambers are truly Narmer's tomb, and we have never found his body. The cemetery at el Quab was disturbed and robbed and dug over across thousands of years. Objects bearing Narmer's name turned up scattered across the site, mixed with the remains of other kings, so that it is genuinely difficult to say which tomb was his with full confidence. Some scholars have even suggested that his true tomb may lie elsewhere, perhaps still hidden beneath the sands, undiscovered. The body of the first king of Egypt, the man who joined the two lands, who founded the capital, who began the longest line of kings the world has known, has never been found, and may never be. We have his name carved in stone. We have his image towering on his palette. We have the objects of his reign scattered from Nubia to the lands of the northeast. But the man himself, his bones, his face, his physical remains, these have slipped away from us into the dark. There is something fitting and something deeply moving in that. The founder stands at the very edge of what we can know, half in the light of history and half in the shadow of the time before it. The German Archaeological Institute continued the work at Abydos across the decades that followed, and under the direction of the Egyptologist G. Fanter Dreyer, it made discoveries that pushed our knowledge of writing and kingship even further back before Narmer himself. In a tomb older than the First Dynasty, a tomb the scholars labeled Uj belonging to a ruler who lived generations before Narmer, Dreyer's team found small labels of bone and ivory, marked with signs that appeared to be among the very earliest writing known anywhere in Egypt. Perhaps among the earliest writing anywhere on Earth. These tiny tags, scratched with the names of places and quantities and goods, suggest that writing in Egypt did not begin with Narmer, but was already developing in the generations before him, in the same southern world from which he sprang. And this deepens our picture of Narmer, not as a sudden miracle, but as the climax of a long rise, the inheritor of an emerging writing system, an emerging kingship, an emerging state, which he gathered together and carried across the threshold into history. The numbers are striking when you consider them. Writing, kingship, monumental building, long, distance trade, a unified state stretching hundreds of miles along a river, all of it crystallizing within a span of a few centuries. In this one narrow valley, at the dawn of the human record, it is one of the most concentrated bursts of innovation in the entire story of our species. The evidence has continued to grow, even into recent years, and some of the newest finds are among the most remarkable. Out in the desert of the Sinai, in a place called the Wadi Amira, scholars discovered rock inscriptions carved by ancient Egyptian expeditions. And among them, they read the names of the earliest kings, including Narmer, carved into the desert rock far from the Nile Valley, marking the passage of royal expeditions in the very first generations of the kingdom. These inscriptions, studied in recent years, have helped scholars refine the order and the relationships of the early kings and queens, and they confirm once again just how far the reach of Narmer's young kingdom extended. Every few years, it seems, a new find, a ceiling, an inscription, a fragment of pottery bearing the Serach of Narmer, adds another small piece to the picture, sometimes confirming what we thought, sometimes complicating it, always reminding us how much remains to be learned. Let us pause here on the matter of dates, because it is one of the places where honest uncertainty rules. When exactly did Narmer live? When exactly was Egypt united? The traditional answer, the one you will most often hear, places the unification at around 3,100 years before the Common Era, or a little earlier, around 3,150. But the truth is that the absolute dates for this earliest period are genuinely uncertain, and scholars have proposed a range stretching across several centuries. The further back we go, the harder it becomes to fix events to a precise year, for we are beyond the reach of any continuous written chronology and must rely on careful study of objects, on the sequence of styles, and on the methods of radiocarbon dating, which give us ranges rather than exact years. So when we say Narmer lived around 3,100 years before the Common Era, we should hold that figure loosely as the best estimate of careful scholars rather than a certain fact. The deep past does not yield exact dates easily. It offers us instead a range, a probability, a careful guess, and the wisdom to know the difference between what we know and what we suppose. Now we must turn, as we always must when speaking of ancient Egypt, to the strange claims that gather around it like mist, the fringe theories, the pseudo-history, the notion that the achievements of the early Egyptians were too great to be the work of ordinary human beings. You will hear it said in certain corners that Egypt's wonders must have been the work of visitors from the stars, or the survivors of a lost super-civilization, or some vanished race with powers we have forgotten. And we should be clear and calm about this, because the truth matters. There is no evidence. None. For any of it. The unification of Egypt, the birth of its writing, the rise of its kingship, the building of its monuments, were the work of human beings, ordinary and extraordinary, working with the materials and the knowledge of their time, building on the achievements of the generations before them. We can trace that development, step by step, in the archaeological record. We can see writing emerging slowly from simple marks into a full system. We can see kingship developing from local chiefs into the unified monarchy of Narmer. We can see the building techniques growing more ambitious generation by generation, from mud brick to stone, from simple tombs to the pyramids. There is no gap that requires a miracle. There is only the long, patient, astonishing work of a human civilization discovering what it could do. And here is the thing worth holding on to. The real story is far more impressive than the fantasies. It is more wonderful that human beings with stone and copper and the strength of their own hands united a land and invented writing and raised monuments that still stand, than that some outside power did it for them. To credit Egypt's achievements to aliens or lost super races is, in the end, an insult to the people who actually accomplished them. The wonder of Narmer is precisely that he was human. The wonder of Egypt is that human beings made it. And the evidence has humbled the modern world more than once. In its own quiet way, when the Narmer Palette was first studied, scholars marveled at the skill of the carving, the precision and confidence of the work in an object made at the very dawn of Egyptian art. When the early tombs at Abydos were excavated, the sophistication of their organization, the wealth of their contents, the evidence of a complex state already functioning 5,000 years ago, surprised those who had assumed that such early people must have been simple. When the buried boats were found in the desert, full-sized wooden ships laid down at the very beginning of the kingdom, they revealed a mastery of woodworking and a depth of belief that few had imagined for so early an age. Again and again, as the evidence has accumulated, it has revised our sense of how advanced, how organized, how capable these earliest Egyptians truly were. We have a habit of assuming that the further back we go, the cruder and simpler people must have been. The evidence of early Egypt rebukes that assumption. These were people of extraordinary skill and ambition and organization, standing at the very beginning of recorded history, and already doing things that can still make us catch our breath. Let us listen for a moment to the testimony of the scholars themselves, framed as the careful judgments of people who have spent their lives with this evidence. The great Egyptologists who have studied Narmer have been struck, above all, by the sense that he stands at a true beginning, that with him something genuinely new enters the world. They speak of him as the founder, the first ruler of the unified land, the figure at the head of the king lists. They argue, as Petrie did, that he and the legendary Menes are one. They debate, as Kaiser and others have, the exact identification of his tomb and the precise order of the early kings. They caution, as the most careful of them always do, against reading too much certainty into the fragments, and they agree, almost universally, on the central point, that whatever the precise details, Narmer marks the threshold between the divided world of prehistoric Egypt and the unified kingdom that would endure for 3,000 years. The testimony of a century and more of scholarship converges on that single truth. Here is where Egypt begins. Consider, too, how much careful scholarship lies behind something as seemingly simple as reading the king's name. The catfish and the chisel are not a label we can simply pick up and pronounce. They are signs in a writing system that had to be painstakingly deciphered and understood across generations of study. Scholars had to work out that early Egyptian writing used pictures both for ideas and for sounds, that a catfish could stand for the sound that begins its name and a chisel for another sound, and that the two together gave the reading we render as Narmer. They had to compare the sign on the palette with the same sign on ceilings and labels and pottery found across Egypt and beyond, building up, fragment by fragment, the confidence that all these marks named one and the same king. Every time you hear the name Narmer spoken, you are hearing the end product of a long chain of patient decipherment, the work of many scholars over many years, reaching back across 5,000 years to recover the sound of a name that had been silent for almost the whole of recorded history. The recovery of a single name, it turns out, is itself a quiet triumph of human persistence. And yet, and this is the note on which we should end this part of our journey, Most of early Egypt is still buried. For every tomb that has been excavated, others surely remain beneath the sand. For every inscription that has been read, others wait, unread, in the desert. The body of Narmer himself may yet lie somewhere undiscovered. New finds emerge every few years, each one adding to or revising the picture. The story is not finished. The sand still holds its secrets, and the desert is vast, and the early kings lie deep. We know far more than our grandparents did about the birth of Egypt, and our grandchildren will surely know more than we do as the patient work goes on, season after season. In the heat and the dust, recovering piece by piece the lost world of the first king. What we have is a sketch drawn from fragments, astonishing, precious, but incomplete. The full portrait of Narmer remains, for now, half buried in the sand that has kept his secrets for 5,000 years. It's worth dwelling, too, on how very nearly we lost even what we have. For the recovery of the first kings was not a smooth or gentle process. Before Petrie came to Abydos, the royal tombs there had already been dug into by an earlier excavator, a Frenchman named Pharaoh, who worked the site in the closing years of the 1800s with little of the care that Petrie would later bring. By the accounts that came after, his methods were rough, his records poor, and a great deal of irreplaceable evidence was lost or scattered in the process. When Petrie arrived to re-excavate the same ground, he had to work through the wreckage of what had come before, sifting the disturbed earth for the fragments that earlier hands had missed or thrown aside. And from those fragments he reconstructed the order of the first kings. Think of what that means. The framework of earliest Egyptian history, the very sequence of Narmer and his successors, was salvaged from a site that had already been half destroyed, pieced back together from leavings and scraps by a man patient enough to value what others had discarded. So much of what we know hangs not only on the accident of survival, but on the difference between a careful hand and a careless one. Had Petrie not come, had he not cared about the potsherds and the broken ceilings, we might know far less than we do about the man who founded Egypt. Return with me, now, to that great ceremonial mace head from the Falcon City, the one that shows the king enthroned in majesty, because the numbers carved beside that scene deserve a closer look. The numbers are striking, almost beyond belief for so early an age. Beside the enthroned king, the carving appears to record a vast tally. Hundreds of thousands of cattle, more than 1 million goats, and well over 100,000 captive people, gathered as the spoils or the offerings of the king's great occasion. Whether these enormous figures record the plunder of a northern campaign, or the wealth assembled for a royal festival, or some idealized statement of the king's command over the resources of the land. Scholars debate, but simply that such numbers could be conceived and written down at all, at the very dawn of Egyptian writing, tells us something profound. Here was a people who could already count into the hundreds of thousands and beyond, who could record those counts in a written system, who could imagine and administer wealth on a scale that staggers the mind. The administration of a great state requires exactly this: the ability to count, to record, to manage vast quantities, and here it is, fully present in the very first generation of the kingdom. The mace head is not merely a picture of a king on a throne. It is one of the earliest surviving glimpses of the human capacity to govern on a grand scale, to reckon the wealth of a whole land, and to set it down in writing for all time. And the evidence does not only confirm the old story, sometimes it overturns it. And this too is part of the strangeness of studying Narmer. For most of the last century, as we have seen, the palette was read as a straightforward record of conquest, a southern king defeating the north in battle and uniting the land by force. But in recent decades, a new generation of scholars has looked again at the same stone and read it very differently. They have pointed out that the smiting scene, the king with his raised mace, was a stock image of kingship, a piece of royal symbolism that appears on objects before and around Narmer's time, not a snapshot of a particular battle. They have argued that the palette communicates an idea rather than an event, the idea of the king as the bringer of order. the one who triumphs over chaos and joins the land into a harmonious whole, and that to read it as a literal war report is to misunderstand the very language of early Egyptian art. Some have gone further, arguing that the scenes describe a more limited conflict, perhaps a campaign against a particular region of the Delta, rather than the grand single war of unification at all, and that the union of Egypt was achieved gradually by many rulers across many generations, with Narmer as one figure in a long process rather than the lone hero of legend. This is a genuine and ongoing scholarly debate, and it is a fine example of how the study of the past is never finished, how the same object, the same evidence, can be read in new ways as scholars bring new questions and new comparisons to bear. The honest position is to hold both possibilities in mind. The palette may commemorate real victories, it may proclaim an ideal, it may do both at once. What it certainly does, beyond any doubt, is place Narmer at the center of the idea of the unified kingdom, crowned with both the white and the red, and that, in the end, is what matters most. What we have then is a sketch drawn from fragments astonishing, precious but incomplete. The full portrait of Narmer remains, for now, half buried in the sand that has kept his secrets for 5,000 years. So we have followed the evidence from the sacred cache at the Falcon City to the royal tombs at Abydos, from Petrie's careful methods to the German Institute's deep excavations, from the earliest written labels to the rock inscriptions in the desert of the Sinai. We have seen how the first king was recovered, and we have seen the limits of what can be known. Now let us draw back from the details and ask the deeper question. What does all of this mean? What did Narmer truly give the world, and why does it still matter? 5,000 years on. That is the reflection we turn to now, so we come, in the quiet depths of this long night, to the question beneath all the others. We have followed Narmer from the divided world he was born into, through his rise and his union of the two lands, through the founding of his white, walled capital, and the dynasty that grew from him, through the tangle of his names, and the patient work of the scholars who recovered him. But what does it mean? Why does this one obscure king, named for a catfish and a chisel, dead for 5,000 years, still matter? Let us sit with that question for a while. Gently, the way you might sit with a single candle in a dark room, watching the flame. Here is the first and deepest meaning. Narmer stands at a true beginning, one of the very few genuine beginnings in the whole story of human civilization. Before him, in the land of the Nile, there were villages and towns and rival chiefs, a scattered and divided people after him. There was a kingdom, unified, centralized, governed as a single whole, with a written record, a line of kings, a capital, an administration. He stands precisely on the line between those two worlds. Behind him lies the long darkness of prehistory, the age before writing, the age we can only glimpse through broken pottery and silent graves. In front of him lies 3,000 years of recorded history, the longest continuous civilization the world has known. He is the hinge on which that door turns. There are not many such moments in human history, moments when something genuinely new comes into the world and never goes away. The first city, the first writing, the first unified state. Narmer stands at the threshold of several of these at once, in this one narrow valley, at this one moment. Let that sink in. We are speaking of one of the handful of true beginnings in the entire human story. And the thing he began did not fade. This is the second great meaning, and perhaps the most astonishing. We have spoken of it before, but it deserves to be said again. Slowly, because it is so easy to miss how extraordinary it is. The union Narmer made lasted 3,000 years. Think about that span. 3,000 years is longer than the time that separates us from Narmer's own successors. It is longer than the whole of recorded European history. From the union of the two lands to the last of the pharaohs, the basic idea that Narmer embodied, that Egypt is one land, that the king holds both south and north, that he wears both crowns, remained the foundation of Egyptian existence. Kingdoms rose and fell within that span. The land fractured and was reunited again and again. Foreign rulers came and went, but the dream of the united land, the two crowns on one head, never died. Every pharaoh for 3,000 years was, in a sense, repeating Narmer, standing in the place he first defined, wearing the crowns he first joined. No single human achievement, perhaps, has ever cast so long a shadow. One man, or the moment one man embodied, shaped the self-understanding of a civilization for 3,000 years. There is a third meaning, quieter and more human. Narmer reminds us of how much can be lost, and how much can survive. We do not have his body. We are not certain of his tomb. We cannot fully resolve his name. Of the man himself, his voice, his face, his thoughts, the texture of his days, we know almost nothing. He has slipped almost entirely into the dark, and yet we have his name carved as a fish and a chisel into stone, and we can still read it. We have his image, towering on his palette, mace raised, crowned. We have the objects of his reign scattered across the ancient world. We have the memory the Egyptians kept of him for 3,000 years, passed down through their lists and their temples. From the wreckage of 5,000 years, enough survived that we can still, faintly, make him out. Still speak his name, still tell his story, still feel, across that immense gulf of time, the presence of a human being who lived and ruled and died at the dawn of his world. There is something almost unbearably moving in that. So much was lost, and yet just enough remained. This is not science fiction. This is not legend or myth or the invention of storytellers. This is real history, recovered from the real earth by real scholars, resting on real objects you could go and stand before today. The Narmer Palette exists. You can see it in its museum. The royal tombs at Abydos exist. You can walk the desert where the first kings lie. The buried boats existed, real wooden ships laid in the sand. The whole astonishing story, the union of the two lands, the founding of the kingdom, the birth of writing, the beginning of 3,000 years of pharaohs, is not a tale spun out of nothing. It is the documented truth of how one of the world's great civilizations began. And that, in the end, is more wonderful than any fantasy. We do not need aliens or lost super races or magic to make this story extraordinary. The plain truth is extraordinary enough. Human beings with stone and copper and the strength of their hands and the spark of their minds united a land and invented a civilization. 5,000 years ago, along a river in the desert. That is what happened. That is the meaning of Narmer. There is a fourth meaning, broader still, that reaches beyond Egypt entirely. For what Narmer did when he joined the two lands was something close to the invention of an idea that would shape the whole of human history, the idea of the large unified realm governed as a single whole from a single center. Before this, in the world of the Nile, power was local. A chief or a king ruled a town and its fields, a stretch of riverbank, a single people. What emerged with Narmer was something new and far larger. A single authority reaching across hundreds of miles, binding many towns and many peoples, and two distinct lands into one kingdom, held together by administration and writing, and a shared idea of who ruled and why. This is one of the foundational political inventions of our species, the gathering of a large and varied territory under one lasting government. And Egypt was among the very first places on earth where it happened. When we live today, in nations, large unified lands governed from central capitals, knit together by records and officials and shared symbols, we are living, in a sense, with something whose earliest clear ancestor stands here, in the work of the first king of Egypt. He did not merely unite two lands. He helped invent the very notion of what it means to be one people under one rule. And there is a fifth meaning, subtle and beautiful, woven into the very texture of Egyptian thought ever after. Because Egypt was made by joining two lands, the idea of doubleness brought into harmony ran through Egyptian thinking forever after. The king was not simply the king, he was the lord of the two lands, a title every pharaoh bore for 3,000 years. He wore not one crown but two, joined into the double crown. He was shown again and again flanked by the symbols of south and north, the plant of the south and the plant of the north, bound together around the sign of union. The whole of Egyptian kingship was built around this idea of two things made one, balance achieved out of duality, harmony drawn from what had been divided. And that idea, that deep pattern, began with Narmer. Every time a later pharaoh called himself Lord of the Two Lands, every time the double crown was placed upon a royal head, the memory of Narmer's union was being quietly renewed. He gave Egypt not just a kingdom, but a way of seeing itself, as two halves forever joined, a unity made out of difference, which is perhaps the deepest and most human idea of all. For is that not something we all understand in our own lives? Far from the banks of the Nile and the dawn of history, the longing to make whole what has been divided, the wish to gather the scattered pieces, to join what has been broken apart, to bring two halves together into one. Narmer's story, stripped of its crowns and its conquests, is at its heart a story about that universal longing, the making of one out of two. It is one of the oldest stories there is, and it stands here at the very beginning of recorded history, told in stone by a people 5,000 years gone. The first king did the thing that human beings have always longed to do. He made the divided whole. And perhaps that is the truest reason his name still matters, 5,000 years on. Not because he was a great warrior, though he may have been. Not because he built a famous monument, for his tomb is humble and lost, but because he stands, in our long human story, for the moment when something scattered became something whole, when many became one, when a people first imagined themselves as a single nation and made that imagining real. That is a thing worth remembering. That is a thing worth carrying with you. In a world that so often falls apart, that so often divides and fragments and breaks into pieces, here is a man at the very dawn of history who did the opposite, who gathered, who joined, who united. And the thing he made endured longer than almost anything human beings have ever made. There is hope in that, if you look for it. There is a quiet promise in it. What is divided can be made whole, and what is made whole, if it is made well, can last a very long time indeed. Let us draw the threads of the whole night together. Now, gently, we began in a divided land, two kingdoms along one river, white crown and red, valley and delta. We met a southern king, named for a catfish and a chisel, heir to generations of southern power. We watched him join the two lands by war, or by the slow weight of a long process, or by both, and place both crowns upon a single head. We saw him found a capital at the hinge of the kingdom, the white walls that became Memphis. We met the queen at his side and the dynasty that grew from him, the line of kings and powerful queens who carried his union forward. We untangled the puzzle of his names, Narmer and Mes, and the shadows of Scorpion and Hor, Aha. We followed the scholars who dug him out of the sand, and we saw the limits of what they could find. And now we understand what it all means, that Narmer stands at one of the true beginnings of human civilization, that the thing he made endured for 3,000 years, and that from the wreckage of 5,000 years, just enough survived for us to know him at all. He was the first. Before the pyramids, before the great temples, before the golden mask of the boy king, before Cleopatra, before nearly everything we picture when we picture ancient Egypt, there was Narmer, standing on the riverbank at the dawn of his world, joining the two lands, wearing the first crown. Everything that came after, all 3,000 years of it, flowed from that single beginning. And that is why 5,000 years on, in the quiet of this long night, his name is still worth speaking. The catfish, the chisel, the first king, the first crown, the birth of a nation. Rest with that for a moment as we begin, slowly, to bring our long journey to its close. The night is deep now, and our long journey is nearly done. So let us bring it gently to rest. The way the Nile itself slows and spreads and grows calm as it nears the end of its long course to the sea. There is nothing more to learn tonight. Nothing more you need to hold on to. You can let the facts go now if you wish, and simply rest in the feeling of the story. The great river, the divided land, the southern king, the first crown. Picture it one last time. Softly, the Nile at dawn, dark and still, the cliffs turning gold, the first long light sliding across the water. A narrow ribbon of green pressed between the red deserts, the white-walled towns of the south, the Falcon City with its sacred enclosure, the smoke rising from the cooking fires, and a man, a king, named for a catfish and a chisel, rising out of the shadow of the time before history, gathering the two lands into his hands and placing upon his own head the first crown of a single Egypt. It happened 5,000 years ago, along that river. In that desert, it happened, and from it grew one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. He who united the two lands. That is the answer to the question we began with: who was Narmer, and what did he do? He took a divided country, south and north, white crown and red, and he joined it into one. And he founded the line of kings that would rule it for 3,000 years. And he built, at the hinge of the two lands, the white-walled city from which it would be governed. Whether he won it by the sword or inherited the last stage of a long, slow union, whether his name was truly Narmer or the meanings of legend or both, the heart of it is simple and certain. He stands at the beginning. He is the first, and the most beautiful part, the part to carry with you down into sleep, is how much endured. The man is gone. His body has never been found. His face we will never, the texture of his days, the sound of his voice, the thoughts behind his eyes, all of it has dissolved into 5,000 years of silence. And yet his name survives, carved in stone, a fish and a chisel, still legible, still speakable, still his. The Egyptians remembered him for 3,000 years, never letting go of the knowledge that once, at the dawn of their world, a king had made the two lands one. And we remember him still tonight, in this quiet room, across an unimaginable gulf of time. That is a kind of immortality. Not the immortality the Egyptians hoped for, of the body preserved and the soul journeying on, but a quieter kind, the immortality of a name that would not be forgotten, a story that would not quite die. Think, as you drift, of how the Egyptians saw the rising of the sun, not as an ordinary event, but as a daily return, a quiet victory, the light coming back over the long, dark morning after morning. Without fail, they watched it every dawn along their river, and they never stopped finding it wonderful. There is something of that in the story of Narmer, too. He rose at the beginning, like a first dawn over a civilization that would last 3,000 years. And though he set long ago, though he vanished into the dark 5,000 years past, his light, in a sense, is still reaching us, still arriving, faint and steady, across all that time, the way the light of a distant star still arrives long after the star itself has gone. Let your breathing slow now, as the river slows. Let the day you have carried settle and grow quiet, the way the floodwaters settle and grow still, and leave behind the soft, dark earth. There is nothing to hold on tonight, nothing to solve, nothing to remember. The first king has been resting for 5,000 years, and he asks nothing of you. The great river has been flowing for longer than memory. You can simply rest here in the calm and the dark, and let the long, quiet story carry you down towards sleep the way the current carries a small boat, gently, without effort, toward the sea. Let the centuries roll backward one more time. Slowly, the way they did when we began past our own age, past the temples and the pyramids, past all of it, back and back, layer beneath layer, until there is only the river, and the desert and the soft first light. And there, at the very bottom of all that time, a single figure on the riverbank, crowned, quiet, the first of all the kings. He is not frightening. He is not far away. He is only a man who lived at the dawn of the world and did a thing that had never been done, and then lay down to rest, as you are resting now, beneath the same stars that still turn above the same river. And think of all the ones who came after him, the long line stretching away into the centuries. each one rising and ruling and setting like the sun, the kings and the queens, the builders of tombs and temples, the powerful women who steered the kingdom, the boy king and his gold, the great builders, the last of the pharaohs, all of them downstream of this one quiet beginning. All of them carried, like everything in Egypt, on the same slow current that began to flow here. With him at the start, 3,000 years of them. And before them all, the first, the catfish and the chisel, the white crown and the red. The two lands made one. There is a deep comfort in it. If you let yourself feel it, the sense of how long the river has flowed, how many dawns have come and gone, how much has risen and set, and been carried away, and yet how the essential thing endures, the land made whole, the name not forgotten. The story still told, on a quiet night, 5,000 years on, things pass and things remain, and the river goes on flowing through all of it, patient and unhurried. Toward the sea you are a part of that long flowing too tonight. One more soul in the long line of those who have heard the story and carried it a little further before letting it go. So let it go now, softly. Let the names blur and the dates dissolve, and the crowns fade into the dark. You do not need them, they will keep. The first king will still be there tomorrow, resting in the desert, watched over by the catfish and the chisel, and the river will still be flowing, and the story will still be waiting. Whenever you wish to return to it, breathe slowly in and out. The way the river rises and falls, the way the tide of the great flood comes in across the fields and then withdraws again, leaving everything richer than before. In and out. Slow and deep and easy. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest. The long story is told, the two lands are joined. The first crown is set upon the first king, and he is at peace in the desert. And so, now may you be at peace, here, in the quiet and the dark. Picture, if it helps you settle, the surface of the Nile at night, black and smooth and silver where the moon touches it, barely moving, vast and calm, stretching away into the dark in both directions, north toward the sea and south toward the distant lands where the waters are born. No sound but the faint lap of the water against the reeds. No light but the moon and the wheeling stars that the Egyptians watched and named and loved. The same stars that turned above the first king 5,000 years ago. The same river, flowing then, as it flows now patient and eternal, carrying everything gently downstream, toward rest, toward sleep, toward the wide and quiet sea. And there, far upstream at the very beginning of it all, the first king sleeps as you are about to sleep. The man named for a catfish and a chisel, who took a divided land and made it whole, and then lay down in the desert to rest, and has rested there ever since, while 3,000 years of kings rose and set behind him, and 5,000 years of dawns came and went above him, and the great river flowed on and on and on. So let the river run on north toward the sea, under the stars. Let the white walls of the first city gleam in the moonlight at the hinge of the two lands. Let the first king rest in the desert at Abydos, wherever exactly he lies among the tombs of the dynasty he began, with the buried boats waiting in the sand for a journey that the Egyptians believed would never truly end. Let the great palette rest in its quiet museum, the catfish and the chisel still watching over the king's eternal triumph. And let the name endure, as it has endured for 5,000 years, and as it will endure long after this night is over. Narmer, the first king, the joiner of the two lands, the wearer of the first crown. You do not need to remember any of it. The story will keep, and you can return to it another night. For now there is only the calm and the dark and the slow, steady rhythm of a river that has been flowing for longer than memory. The same river that fed the first kingdom, the same river that carried the first king's fleets, the same river that still flows tonight, through the heart of a land that he, more than 5,000 years ago, first made whole. So let your thoughts grow slow and soft and dim, like the last light fading from the western cliffs at the close of the day. Let the long story drift away downstream. There is nothing to hold, nothing to fear, nothing to do. Only the river and the dark, and the deep quiet of a night that has settled over the two lands as it has settled over them, peaceful and unbroken, for 5,000 years and more. The first king is at rest, and now, gently, so are you. Rest now, the two lands are one. The first crown is set, and the great river flows on quietly into the dark, toward the sea. As it always has, and as it always will, sleep well.